Have you ever wondered why certain people seem to possess an almost magnetic presence, an inner peace that draws you in, while others, despite their apparent success, leave you feeling somehow unsettled? What if I told you that this difference isn't about charisma, wealth, or even intelligence, but about something far more profound, something Carl Jung called shadow integration? Jung, the legendary Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, discovered that every person carries within them a hidden aspect of their personality, what he termed the shadow. This shadow contains all the parts of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or hidden away, because they didn't fit the image we wanted to project to the world. But here's where it gets fascinating. Jung found that those who had successfully integrated their shadow, who had faced and embraced these rejected parts, experienced a profound transformation that touched every aspect of their lives. Today, I'm going to share with you the 7 unmistakable signs that reveal when someone has successfully integrated their shadow. These aren't just psychological theories. They're observable patterns that Jung documented throughout decades of working with patients, patterns that can help you recognize this profound shift, not only in others, but more importantly, in yourself. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand why shadow integration is perhaps the most crucial psychological work any human being can undertake, and you'll know exactly what to look for as you embark on this transformative journey. The first sign that someone has successfully integrated their shadow is perhaps the most paradoxical. They become simultaneously more accepting of others and less affected by other people's opinions. Think about someone you know who possesses this quality, perhaps a teacher, mentor, or friend who seems genuinely comfortable with themselves and others. When you're around them, you feel accepted for who you are, yet they're not constantly seeking your approval or validation. This happens because of a fundamental principle Jung discovered about projection. Before shadow integration, we unconsciously project our rejected qualities onto others. That person who irritates you with their arrogance, that's often your own disowned arrogance reflecting back at you. The individual whose neediness makes you uncomfortable, it's likely triggering your own unacknowledged neediness. Jung called this psychological projection, and it's one of the primary ways our shadow controls our relationships and perceptions. But when someone has integrated their shadow, something remarkable occurs. Having acknowledged and accepted their own capacity for arrogance, neediness, jealousy, or any other negative trait, they no longer need to see these qualities as threats when they appear in others. They can observe human frailty with compassion rather than judgment, because they've made peace with their own frailty. This doesn't mean they become doormats or lose their discernment, quite the opposite. They can see situations and people more clearly because they're not viewing everything through the distorted lens of their projections. Simultaneously, because they've stopped rejecting parts of themselves, they no longer depend on external validation to feel whole. Their sense of self-worth comes from integration, not perfection. They've learned that being fully human means embracing the full spectrum of human experience, including the parts that society often deems unacceptable. The second sign emerges in how they handle conflict and criticism. A person who has integrated their shadow possesses what Jung would call psychological resilience, not because they're hard or defensive, but because they've already faced their own inner critic and made peace with their imperfections. Consider how most people react when criticized. The immediate response is often defensive. We justify, explain, or counterattack. This happens because criticism threatens our carefully constructed self-image, the persona Jung described as the mask we wear to navigate social situations. But when someone has integrated their shadow, they've already acknowledged their capacity for the very things they might be criticized for. If someone calls them selfish, they don't react with immediate defensiveness because they've already recognized and accepted their own selfish impulses. They can evaluate the criticism objectively. Is there truth in it they can learn from, or is it more about the other person's projections? This doesn't mean they become passive or accept abuse. Rather, they respond from a place of centeredness rather than reactivity. They might say something like, "You know, there's probably some truth in what you're saying. Let me think about that." Or, "I can see why you might feel that way, though my experience is different." This kind of response often disarms conflict because it doesn't feed the drama that many arguments thrive on. Jung observed that this shift happens because shadow integration reduces what he called ego inflation. The ego, our conscious sense of self, no longer needs to maintain a perfect image because it's been reunited with the shadow. This creates a kind of psychological humility, not self-deprecation, but a realistic assessment of one's capabilities and limitations. The third sign manifests in their relationship with their own emotions, particularly the so-called negative ones. Before shadow integration, people often experience emotions like anger, sadness, or fear as enemies to be conquered or suppressed. But someone who has integrated their shadow has developed what Jung termed emotional alchemy, the ability to transform emotional experiences into wisdom and energy. Watch how they handle anger, for instance. Instead of exploding in rage or stuffing it down until it emerges as passive aggression, they can feel the anger fully while remaining conscious of its message. They might say, "I notice I'm feeling angry about this situation. What is this anger telling me about my values or boundaries?" They've learned that anger isn't inherently destructive. It's information about what matters to them and where their limits have been crossed. This emotional integration extends to all feelings. Their sadness becomes a doorway to compassion and depth. Their fear becomes a signal to pay attention and assess real dangers versus imagined threats. Their jealousy becomes information about their own desires and insecurities. Jung called this process holding the tension of the opposites, the ability to experience contradictory emotions without being torn apart by them. What's particularly striking is how this emotional integration affects their presence. There's a quality of aliveness and authenticity that draws people in because they're not constantly managing their emotional experience. They can be with whatever is arising without being overwhelmed by it. This creates space for others to feel their own emotions more freely as well. The fourth sign appears in their relationship with power and authority. Jung noticed that shadow integration profoundly changes how people relate to hierarchy, both when they're in positions of authority and when they're subject to it. Someone who has integrated their shadow understands that the capacity for both submission and domination exists within every human being, and this understanding transforms how they navigate power dynamics. When they're in leadership positions, they're less likely to abuse their power because they've acknowledged their own capacity for cruelty and domination. They've faced what Jung called the power shadow, the part of the psyche that enjoys control and dominance over others. By integrating this shadow, they can exercise authority with wisdom and restraint. They lead by inspiration rather than intimidation because they're not trying to suppress their own feelings of powerlessness by controlling others. Conversely, when they're in subordinate positions, they're less likely to be either rebellious or submissive in unhealthy ways. They can respect legitimate authority without sacrificing their dignity or autonomy because they're not projecting their own disowned authority onto others. They've learned to be their own authority in matters of values and personal truth while cooperating effectively in structured environments. This balanced relationship with power often makes them natural mediators and counselors. People sense that they can hold space for conflicting perspectives without taking sides or trying to control outcomes. They've learned what Jung considered one of the highest psychological achievements, the ability to be present with tension without needing to resolve it immediately. Now here's where I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge something important. If you're recognizing yourself in some of these signs, or if you're feeling inspired to begin your own shadow work, I want you to know that you're not alone in this journey. The path of individuation, as Jung called it, is perhaps the most challenging and rewarding work a human being can undertake. If this exploration is resonating with you, I encourage you to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and experiences not only help you process this material more deeply, but also create a community of seekers supporting each other in this profound work. The fifth sign emerges in their capacity for what Jung called active imagination and creative expression. When someone has integrated their shadow, they often experience a marked increase in creative energy and intuitive abilities. This happens because creative expression requires access to the full range of human experience, including the messy, dark, and socially unacceptable parts that the shadow contains. Think of the most compelling artists, writers, or innovators you know. There's often a quality of authenticity and depth to their work that comes from their willingness to explore the full spectrum of human experience. They don't sanitize their creative expression to fit social expectations because they've made peace with their own complexity. Their art, whether it's literally art or simply the art of living, reflects the integration of light and shadow, beauty and darkness, joy and sorrow. This creative expression also extends to their problem-solving abilities. Because they can access a broader range of internal resources, they often find innovative solutions to challenges. They're not limited by conventional thinking because they're not afraid of unconventional aspects of themselves. Jung observed that many of his most creative patients began producing their most meaningful work after they had done significant shadow integration. The sixth sign manifests in their relationships, particularly in their capacity for genuine intimacy. Before shadow integration, relationships often become battlegrounds for projection and unconscious dynamics. We fall in love with projections of our anima or animus, Jung's terms for the unconscious feminine aspect in men and masculine aspect in women, and then become disappointed when our partners fail to live up to these projections. But someone who has integrated their shadow has also typically done significant work with their contrasexual side. A man who has integrated his shadow has also begun to integrate his anima, developing his capacity for receptivity, intuition, and emotional depth. A woman who has done this work has begun to integrate her animus, developing her capacity for assertion, logical thinking, and goal-directed action. This integration creates a kind of psychological wholeness that doesn't desperately need another person to complete them. In relationships, this manifests as the ability to love someone for who they actually are, rather than for who they imagine them to be, or need them to be. They can see their partner's shadow without being threatened by it because they've made peace with their own. They can offer support during difficult times without trying to fix or change their partner because they understand that everyone must do their own inner work. These relationships tend to have a quality of psychological safety and mutual growth. Both partners can be authentic without fear of rejection because they're both committed to truth over comfort, growth over stagnation. Conflicts, when they arise, become opportunities for deeper understanding, rather than power struggles or attempts to prove who's right. The seventh and perhaps most profound sign is what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and find meaning in apparent contradictions. Someone who has successfully integrated their shadow develops a kind of psychological flexibility that allows them to be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, confident and humble, passionate and peaceful. This capacity for paradox extends to their worldview. They can hold space for the reality that life is both beautiful and tragic, that humans are capable of both great love and terrible cruelty. That meaning can be found even in suffering. They don't need to resolve these contradictions into simple answers because they've learned to live comfortably with mystery and complexity. Jung believed this was the hallmark of psychological maturity, the ability to contain opposites without being torn apart by them. In practical terms, this might mean they can feel profound sadness about global suffering while simultaneously experiencing gratitude for their own blessings. They can acknowledge the reality of evil in the world while maintaining faith in human goodness. They can be realistic about limitations while remaining optimistic about possibilities. This psychological flexibility makes them incredibly resilient in the face of life's inevitable challenges. When crisis strikes, they don't collapse into despair or deny reality with false optimism. Instead, they meet difficulty with what Jung called conscious suffering, the ability to feel pain fully while maintaining connection to meaning and purpose. But here's where the true transformation reveals itself. And this is perhaps the most important insight Jung offered about shadow integration. When we stop running from our darkness, we discover that it contains not just our rejected negative qualities, but also our rejected positive qualities, our disowned brilliance, creativity, power, and capacity for love. Many people are more afraid of their light than their darkness. We reject our potential for greatness because it feels too big, too overwhelming, or too threatening to our familiar sense of smallness. But when we integrate our shadow, we reclaim not just our capacity for anger, selfishness, or weakness, but also our capacity for leadership, artistic genius, profound love, and transformative impact on the world. Someone who has done this work often radiates what Jung called numinous presence, a quality that's hard to define but impossible to miss. They seem to carry something larger than their individual personality, as if they've become a conduit for archetypal energies. This isn't grandiosity or inflation. It's the natural result of a personality that's no longer constricted by unconscious rejections and projections. Jung observed that when people complete significant shadow work, they often begin to experience what he called synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that suggest a deeper order and intelligence in life. This happens because they're no longer fighting against the flow of their own nature. When internal conflicts are resolved, external life often begins to align in surprising ways. They also develop what Jung termed psychological sovereignty, the ability to be themselves, regardless of external circumstances. They're no longer dependent on specific conditions to feel okay about themselves because their sense of worth comes from integration rather than achievement or approval. This doesn't mean they stop growing or striving, but their motivation comes from authentic desire rather than compulsive need. Perhaps most remarkably, they often become natural healers and guides for others, not because they have perfect lives, but because they've learned to transform wounds into wisdom. They understand that everyone carries a shadow, everyone struggles with inner conflicts, and everyone has the potential for integration and wholeness. Their presence becomes a kind of permission for others to embark on their own journey of self-discovery. Jung believed that this was not just individual healing, but collective healing. Every person who integrates their shadow reduces the amount of unconscious projection and conflict in the world. They become what he called twice born, individuals who have died to their old, fragmented way of being and been reborn into wholeness. The path to shadow integration isn't easy, and it's never truly complete. Jung himself continued this work until the end of his life, always discovering new depths to explore and integrate. But the signs we've explored today offer a roadmap for recognizing progress on this profound journey. If you recognize these qualities in yourself, celebrate this recognition. It suggests you've begun the sacred work of becoming whole. If you don't yet see these signs in your life, let them serve as inspiration rather than judgment. Every great journey begins with a single step, and the very fact that you're drawn to this exploration suggests your psyche is ready for deeper integration. The invitation Jung offers us through his understanding of the shadow is both challenging and hopeful. We don't have to remain unconscious victims of our rejected aspects. We can choose consciousness over reactivity, integration over fragmentation, wisdom over ignorance. We can become the authors of our own transformation rather than unconscious players in patterns we don't understand. As you continue on your own journey of self-discovery, remember that shadow integration isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming complete. It's about reclaiming the full range of your humanity so that you can live with authenticity, love with depth, and contribute to the world from a place of genuine wholeness. The signs we've explored today aren't destinations, but waypoints on a lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. Trust the process, be patient with yourself, and remember that every step toward consciousness not only transforms your own life, but contributes to the healing of our collective human family. In embracing your shadow, you embrace your light. In accepting your darkness, you discover your capacity for illumination. This is the paradox and the promise of Jung's profound insight, that in facing what we most fear within ourselves, we find what we most need to become whole.